Have you ever wondered about the untold story of Africa's relationship with the West? Today, we're going to delve into that narrative, a tale that is as complex as it is intriguing. Africa, a continent rich in culture and resources, has a history intricately woven with the Western world, a tapestry that is often overlooked or misunderstood. Over the centuries, this relationship has been marked by exploitation and power dynamics that have shaped the Africa we see today. From the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade to the era of colonization, and even in our modern world, Africa has been a stage where the West has played its parts, often at the expense of the African people and their lands. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, understanding this history is crucial to understanding the present and shaping a better future. So let's embark on this journey. Let's dig deep and let's uncover the truth. Join us as we take a journey back in time to unravel the true narrative. Our journey begins in the 15th century, a time when Africa was a continent rich in resources and culture. It was an era when the allure of Africa's wealth and splendor began to tempt the Western world. The first to answer this call were the Portuguese, setting sail from their homeland with a thirst for exploration and, unbeknownst to them, a course for exploitation. Portugal, a seafaring nation with a burgeoning thirst for exploration, found in Africa a land teeming with resources. Gold, ivory, and an abundance of other goods were ripe for the taking, and take they did. But the Portuguese didn't just stop at material wealth. They took something far more valuable, something irreplaceable. They took people. The transatlantic slave trade was a gruesome chapter in human history, and it was during the 15th century that this horrific practice began to take root. African men, women, and children were captured, enslaved, and transported across the ocean to work on plantations and in homes. This was not just a theft of human lives, but a theft of human potential, a theft of a continent's future. But the exploitation of Africa wasn't solely confined to the slave trade. The continent's vast resources were plundered, its land exploited, and its culture appropriated. From the ivory tusks of its elephants to the gold in its earth, Africa was seen as a treasure trove to be looted and exploited. This era marked the beginning of a long and dark period in Africa's history, a period characterized by the loss of human dignity, the erosion of cultural identity, and the ruthless extraction of resources. It was a time of unparalleled exploitation, a time when Africa was seen not as a continent of rich cultures and vibrant societies, but as a source of wealth to be plundered and people to be enslaved. The dawn of exploitation had begun, forever changing the course of Africa's history. Fast forward to the 19th century, Africa found itself under the dominion of European powers. The colonial era had begun, and it was a period that would drastically alter the continent's destiny. In the heart of this era was a notorious event, the Berlin Conference of 1884. This was not just any conference. It was a meeting that would determine the fate of an entire continent. 14 European nations gathered around a table in Berlin, not to negotiate, but to carve up Africa like a grand feast. In this conference, no African voices were heard, no African leaders were present. It was a blatant display of imperial arrogance. Africa was divided among these European powers, each claiming their piece of the pie. The continent was partitioned with a casual disregard for the rich cultures, diverse languages, and complex political systems that had thrived there for centuries. Colonial rule was marked by massive exploitation. Africa's abundant natural resources, from gold to diamonds, from ivory to rubber, were plundered. The continent was turned into a vast resource mine for the European powers. They imposed their languages, religions, and systems of administration, eroding the indigenous cultures and traditions. Moreover, the colonizers implemented policies of divide and rule, turning ethnic groups against each other, sowing seeds of discord that continue to sprout conflicts even today. The colonizers might have departed, but they left behind a legacy of division and mistrust. The colonization era was not just about territorial control. It was a systemic, calculated process of cultural, economic, and psychological domination. It was an era that disempowered the African people, stole their resources, and suppressed their identities. The colonization era left an indelible mark on Africa, the scars of which are still visible. It is a chapter of history that serves as a stark reminder of the injustices that were perpetrated and the resilience and spirit of the African people who continue to rise above it. As Africa entered the 20th century, winds of change began to blow. The thirst for freedom and self-governance was unquenchable. Independence movements began to sweep across the continent like a wildfire, igniting the hearts and minds of the African people. From the shores of Algeria to the hills of Zimbabwe, the chants for liberation rang loud and clear. However, the journey to independence wasn't a walk in the park. The African people had to endure brutal conflicts, negotiate complex political landscapes, and stand up to the powers that had held them captive for so long. The struggle was real, but the spirit of resilience prevailed. One by one, African nations began to hoist their own flags, a symbol of their hard-earned freedom. But did this mean the end of exploitation? Sadly, the answer is no. With independence came a new form of control, more subtle yet equally insidious, known as neocolonization. This is where the plot thickens. Western powers, unwilling to lose their grip on Africa's abundant resources, devised new mechanisms to maintain control. They might have withdrawn their administrators and soldiers, but they left behind a system that continued to serve their interests. Neocolonization took many forms. Economic control was at the forefront, with Western countries dominating Africa's trade and industries. They dictated the terms of trade, controlled prices, and monopolized key sectors, effectively turning independent African nations into economic vassals. The wealth generated from Africa's rich resources continued to flow out of the continent, filling the coffers of the Western world. Thus, while African nations celebrated their political freedom, their economic freedom remained a distant dream. Political leaders who dared to challenge this status quo were often met with resistance, sometimes even covert operations aimed at destabilizing their regimes. Independence brought hope, but the shadow of exploitation lingered. The struggle for true freedom, for control over Africa's destiny and resources, was far from over. It was simply a new chapter in a long, ongoing narrative of resilience and resistance. In the 21st century, has Africa truly freed itself from the shackles of exploitation? This is a question we should all ponder upon. Let's delve into the modern forms of exploitation. Unfair trade practices, for one, have become a pressing issue. African nations often find themselves on the receiving end of unfavorable trade agreements. These countries have an abundance of raw materials, yet they struggle to reap the benefits. Their wealth is exported, often at meager prices, while finished goods are imported at exorbitant rates. This is a classic example of modern-day exploitation, where the rich get richer and the poor stay poor. Next, let's talk about debt traps. Some nations, under the guise of benevolence, offer loans to African countries. However, these loans often come with high interest rates and stringent conditions. When the time comes to repay, these nations find themselves sinking deeper into debt. It's a cycle that's hard to break, a trap that's difficult to escape from. And then there's the continued control over resources. Despite gaining independence, many African countries are still not entirely free. Their resources continue to be controlled by foreign entities. For instance, multinational corporations backed by powerful nations exploit Africa's oil, diamonds, and minerals. They extract wealth, leaving behind a trail of environmental destruction and social unrest. What's more, the exploitation extends beyond the tangible. Africa's cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and even its indigenous plants are being patented and commercialized by outsiders. This form of biopiracy is a subtle yet insidious form of modern-day exploitation. In this era of globalization and interconnectivity, it's easy to overlook these forms of exploitation. They are often hidden beneath layers of diplomacy, economic jargon, and corporate interests. But they exist, and they persist. The echoes of history continue to reverberate, reminding us that the past is not so distant. With this in mind, it's crucial to recognize these forms of modern-day exploitation and work towards creating a more equitable world. Because the story of Africa is not just about its past, it's about its present, and most importantly, its future. Understanding history is the first step towards change. As we journey back through time, we've seen the unfolding tale of Africa's rich history, marked by periods of prosperity, innovation, and resilience, but also marred by the shadow of exploitation. The story is not just one of a continent, but of humanity itself, a narrative that intertwines us all. We began with the dawn of exploitation, where Africa, in all its richness and diversity, was viewed through the narrow lens of greed and control. The scramble for resources, the disregard for indigenous cultures, and the imposition of alien systems all set the stage for a long, painful epoch of foreign rule. The colonization era only intensified this exploitation. The imposition of arbitrary borders, the ruthless extraction of resources, and the subjugation of native populations under the guise of civilization and progress. Africa was molded not for its own benefit, but for the interests of foreign powers. Then came the era of independence, a time of hope and jubilation. Yet, the specter of neocolonization loomed large. Economic dependence, political interference, and continued resource extraction under new guises showed that the chains of exploitation had merely been transformed, not broken. And now, the modern-day exploitation. The narrative continues with multinational corporations, unfair trade practices, and debt traps. The exploitation has not ceased. It has only adapted to the times. But remember, history is not merely a tale of passive acceptance. It's a saga of resistance, of struggle, of the fight for dignity and sovereignty. And it's in this spirit that we must approach our understanding of Africa's past, present, and future. Acknowledging this past, learning from it, is crucial. It's time to challenge the narratives, to question the status quo, to strive for justice and equality. It's time to recognize the resilience, the strength, and the potential of Africa and its people. Let's not just be bystanders in this journey of discovery. Let's be active participants, catalysts for change. And that change begins with knowledge, with understanding, with empathy. Join us in uncovering more untold stories. Like and subscribe to our channel and become part of our journey to reveal the truth.